When the world stopped fearing America, Trump and the end of automatic obedience, America's problem is not that the world fears it less. It is that the world now knows how to ignore it. For decades, when the United States issued a warning, the world listened, markets moved, allies adjusted policy, rivals reconsidered escalation. But something has changed. Today, Washington still threatens, yet fewer countries react. So, the real question is no longer whether America is powerful, it's whether anyone still believes its threats are inevitable. For most of the past 3/4 of a century, the choreography of American power followed a familiar script. Washington issued warnings. Allies adjusted their behavior. Rivals protested but recalibrated. Markets trembled. Diplomats translated signals into concessions. Aircraft carriers repositioned themselves just visibly enough to remind everyone that history, like gravity, still pointed toward the United States. The system did not always produce peace. But it produced predictability. That script is now faltering, not because America has become weak, but because the world has become less persuadable. In recent confrontations with Iran, trade partners, and even treaty allies, the United States has discovered something uncomfortable. Threats still travel far, but they land less decisively than they once did. Governments that previously treated American warnings as strategic facts increasingly treat them as negotiating positions. Partners hedge. Powers rivaling delay. Middle states diversify. Markets adjust faster than diplomats do. The result is not the collapse of American influence. It is something subtler and potentially more dangerous, the erosion of automatic compliance. For a superpower accustomed to obedience arriving in advance of enforcement, which change feels like defiance, the myth of vanished fear, claims that the world no longer fears American threats are exaggerated. The United States still commands the world's most formidable military projection capability, its dominant financial clearing system, and the deepest alliance network in modern history. No serious strategist mistakes America for declining middle power. Yet fear alone has never sustained hegemony. What sustained American primacy after 1945 was not terror but credibility, the expectation that threats were embedded within durable commitments rather than episodic bargaining tactics. Allies complied not because they were frightened, but because they believed Washington's intentions were stable across administrations. That expectation is fading. In its place has appeared something unfamiliar: strategic patience toward American pressure. Governments now wait to see whether threats persist beyond news cycles. They evaluate whether tariffs survive court challenges. They see whether sanctions outlast elections. They calculate whether deployments signal strategy or theater. Where once there was anticipation, there is now evaluation. The return of multipolar behavior, the post-Cold War era briefly convinced Washington that power could be exercised without negotiation. In the 1990s, American preferences often became global defaults before debate began. NATO expanded. Trade regimes widened. Sanctions multiplied. Military interventions went ahead with limited resistance. That moment was historically unusual. Today's world looks less like a hierarchy and more like a marketplace of alignments. States increasingly hedge rather than choose. They diversify rather than give. They bargain rather than concede. European governments speak cautiously of strategic autonomy. Gulf monarchies coordinate simultaneously with Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. India preserves its diplomatic elasticity. Southeast Asian states accept American naval protection while expanding economic ties with China. None of this constitutes abandonment, it is insurance. Allies are not leaving America. They are preparing for the possibility that America may leave them, or at least change its mind unexpectedly. The transactional presidency meets the institutional alliance. The tension between America's traditional alliance system and President Donald Trump's diplomatic instincts is philosophical as much as strategic. His approach treats international politics as a series of negotiable exchanges between sovereign actors pursuing material advantage. Alliances, in this view, resemble contracts. Commitments are adjustable. Leverage is deployable. This logic is intuitive in commerce. It is destabilizing in security systems. Security alliances are not merely transactions. They are reputational ecosystems. Their value depends less on immediate reciprocity than on long-term predictability. When commitments appear conditional, their deterrent effect weakens even before policy changes occur. European diplomats, accustomed to interpreting American signals as institutional rather than personal, increasingly find themselves decoding presidential rhetoric as though it were a fluctuating market indicator. That shift alone alters alliance behavior. Governments begin to hedge not because guarantees disappear, but because guarantees begin to look negotiable. Iran and the limits of coercive signaling. Iran provides a particularly revealing case study of how American threats now meet resistance rather than compliance. For decades, Washington has relied on economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and military deterrence to shape Tehran's behavior. These instruments have inflicted actual costs. Yet they have not produced strategic surrender. That outcome surprises only those who misunderstand what motivates revolutionary regimes. Iran's leadership does not interpret pressure solely in material terms. It interprets pressure through the lens of regime survival, ideological legitimacy, and historical memory. Concessions risk appearing not merely imprudent but existential. In such contexts, coercion without reciprocity rarely produces accommodation. Instead, it produces endurance. American policymakers often describe sanctions as leverage. Iranian policymakers describe them as confirmation. The difference explains the stalemate, the illusion of unilateral leverage. One of the quiet assumptions underlying recent American diplomacy is that economic dominance automatically translates into compliance. For decades, this assumption appeared justified. Access to dollar clearing systems could reshape national policies overnight. Export controls could freeze industries. Secondary sanctions could isolate entire sectors, yet leverage depends not only on strength but on scarcity. As alternatives appear, regional payment systems, alternative energy markets, diversified supply chains, the cost of resisting American pressure declines. It does not disappear. But it becomes negotiable. Countries no longer need to choose between obedience and isolation. They can choose between inconvenience and adaptation. That difference transforms diplomacy. Threats lose their inevitability. Tariffs and the politics of diversification. Trade disputes illustrate this transformation particularly clearly. Tariffs once functioned primarily as instruments of negotiation. Today they increasingly function as incentives for structural adjustment. When partners face repeated trade penalties, they respond not by conceding indefinitely but by redesigning supply chains. European industrial policy has become more assertive. Asian production networks have become more regionalized. Gulf energy exporters have diversified currency exposure. Emerging economies have strengthened local manufacturing ability. Each adjustment reduces marginal dependence on American markets. Individually, these changes appear modest. Collectively, they accumulate into strategic autonomy. The problem of yes men. Critics often attribute diplomatic miscalculation to the presence of advisors reluctant to contradict presidential assumptions. Such criticisms are hardly unique to any administration. Leaders throughout history have preferred agreement to friction, yet insulation has measurable strategic consequences. When decision-makers receive filtered feedback, they overestimate compliance and underestimate resistance. Policies designed for cooperative environments encounter competitive realities. Signals intended as warnings are interpreted as bargaining tactics. Allies begin preparing contingencies that Washington does not expect. Feeling lag becomes policy failure. Superpowers rarely decline because they lack resources. They decline because they misinterpret responses. Identity wars in a transactional age. Another difficulty facing American diplomacy lies in the mismatch between transactional negotiation models and identity-driven conflicts. Many contemporary crises cannot be resolved through material bargaining alone. Territorial adjustments, sanctions, relief, or trade concessions rarely address disputes rooted in legitimacy or historical memory. Russia's confrontation with Ukraine is not merely about borders. Israel's rivalry with Iran is not merely about deterrence. China's claims about Taiwan are not merely about sovereignty in the legal sense. These conflicts persist because they involve narratives about national purpose. When policymakers treat them as property disputes, they misunderstand their durability. The constitutional limits of presidential power abroad. Foreign observers sometimes attribute fluctuations in American credibility entirely to individual leadership style. Yet the structure of the American government itself plays a subtler role. The United States Constitution deliberately fragments foreign policy authority. Congress controls funding. The Senate ratifies treaties. Courts review executive actions. Administrations change every 4 years. Legislative coalitions shift more often still. This system protects domestic liberty. It complicates international signaling. When partners evaluate American commitments, they do not ask only what a president intends. They ask whether Congress agrees, whether courts will intervene, whether the next administration will reverse course. If the answers are uncertain, threats appear temporary. Temporary threats rarely produce lasting compliance. The post-unipolar learning curve. During the brief unipolar moment following the Cold War, American policymakers grew accustomed to shaping outcomes without negotiation. Military superiority, technological advantage, and financial centrality created an environment in which resistance carried extraordinary costs. That environment has changed. China's economic rise has expanded strategic alternatives. Regional organizations have strengthened coordination ability. Middle powers have bought greater diplomatic flexibility. Energy markets have diversified. Digital infrastructure has multiplied communication channels. None of these developments cuts American primacy, but together they reduce its exclusivity. States now have choices, strategic autonomy as polite resistance. European discussions of strategic autonomy illustrate how allies respond to uncertainty without abandoning alliances outright. Officially, autonomy enhances burden sharing. Unofficially, it reduces vulnerability to policy volatility in Washington. European defense initiatives aim less at replacing NATO than at supplementing it. Industrial policies seek resilience rather than independence. Diplomatic diversification provides insurance rather than separation. The language stays cooperative, the intention is precautionary. Allies rarely announce distrust. They prepare quietly for it. Gulf hedging and the diplomacy of survival. Nowhere is strategic diversification more visible than in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates increasingly coordinate energy policy with Russia while expanding investment ties with China. Security cooperation with Washington continues. Diplomatic flexibility grows alongside it. This behavior reflects neither betrayal nor alignment shift, it reflects risk management. Regional governments have learned that dependence on a single protector invites vulnerability. Multipolar diplomacy offers redundancy. Redundancy produces autonomy. The domestic roots of international unpredictability. Foreign governments do not analyze American policy only through strategic lenses. They analyze it through electoral ones. Polarization within the United States has made foreign policy appear less continuous than it once did. Agreements signed under one administration may be reversed under another. Sanctions regimes expand and contract. Alliance commitments fluctuate rhetorically even when they stay operationally intact. Partners therefore hedge not against American weakness but against American change. Continuity reassures allies more effectively than power impresses them. The psychology of ignored threats. The most striking feature of the current diplomatic environment is not resistance itself but the calmness with which resistance occurs. Governments no longer react to American warnings with panic. They respond with scheduling adjustments. Consultations. Hedging strategies. Public statements expressing respect combined with private plans for adaptation. This composure signals a shift in expectations. Threats are now treated as variables rather than conclusions. The persistence of American advantage. None of this implies that the United States has entered irreversible decline. Its military alliances remain unmatched. Its universities attract global talent. Its financial system anchors international liquidity. Its technological innovation ecosystem continues to shape emerging industries, but influence depends not only on ability, it depends on predictability. Superpowers that appear unpredictable invite diversification even from friends. Negotiation returns to center stage. The disappearance of automatic compliance does not weaken diplomacy. It restores it. During the unipolar era, negotiation sometimes became procedural rather than substantive. Today it has regained strategic importance. Agreements require persuasion rather than announcement. Coalitions require maintenance rather than assumption. Threats require explanation rather than repetition. This shift demands patience, it rewards reciprocity. The limits of arrogance as strategy. Critics often describe recent American diplomacy as arrogant. The accusation misunderstands the nature of the problem. Arrogance has never prevented powerful states from influencing outcomes. What matters is not tone but calibration. When threats exceed enforceable commitments, credibility declines. When signals contradict institutional behavior, allies hedge. When policies shift faster than partners can adapt, cooperation slows. The issue is not personality, it is an alignment between rhetoric and structure, a world that calculates rather than obeys. The emerging international order does not reject American leadership. It interrogates it. Governments increasingly ask what Washington intends, how long it intends it, and whether those intentions will survive domestic politics. They compare American offers with alternatives from China, regional institutions, or multilateral arrangements. They weigh compliance against diversification. This is not rebellion, it is a rational adaptation, the quiet end of automatic primacy. For most of the 20th century, American threats carried authority because they stood for systems rather than individuals. Allies assumed continuity. Rivals expected persistence. Markets expected enforcement. Today those assumptions require confirmation rather than acceptance. Power stays, certainty has diminished. And in international politics, certainty is often the most valuable currency of all. The world has not stopped fearing the United States, it has learned how to wait.